I'm really only a whistleblower in the sense that I published research in the peer-reviewed scientific literature that challenged EPA's position on this issue. And it culminated in the termination of my employment with EPA and the University of Georgia in 2008, mainly because of a paper that, a research article I published in Nature that was co-authored by Jerry Melillo. Dr. Melillo at that time that we published that research in 1999 was Al Gore's Associate Director for the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. So my research in that area garnered a lot of media attention, really from virtually every media outlet there was at the time. It drew attention to the fact, simply put, that we have a Clean Water Act and Clean Air Acts, but no Clean Soil Act. So soil has become the free-for-all for industry to send its toxic waste to. I think few people, even in the scientific community, have gotten the big picture of what EPA has brought about since it was created under the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts under President Nixon in 1970. And I was working for the Department of Interior at that time, and that was gobbled up by the new agency, EPA. So to tell this story in the simplest terms, what dawned on me in the course of time as a research scientist working on climate change, working on adverse health associated with pollutants that get into air and water at the time, is this. EPA has developed and promulgated regulations that very tightly restrict the introduction of heavy metals, toxic organic chemicals to air and water under these acts of Congress, but left wide open what goes on the land. Everybody, every time the new EPA administrator is appointed, harkens back to the days of Rachel Carson and the problems we had that we began to get a grasp of at that time, that these toxic organic chemicals at very low concentrations in water, things like DDT, for example, that Rachel Carson was concerned about. The flip side of that coin is that they're highly soluble in animal fats because they're not very soluble in water. When Jimmy Carter came along and began to build sewage treatment plants at every municipality in this country, created a process by which trace amounts of these chemicals were extracted from water, because an entire body of science showed that though there's low concentrations, parts per billion, parts per trillion levels, they're biomagnified. So if a pregnant mother drinks water on a regular basis with parts per billion of DDT and a host of other chemicals, other pesticides, pharmaceuticals, petrochemicals that go into air and water, if she's exposed to those, even for drinking water, for example, they accumulate, they biomagnify, and come out in her breast milk at millions of times higher concentrations. And therein lies the problem. So wastewater treatment plants were built to clean up our water, and they do a very good job of that. They do a good job because sewage is about 30% animal fat. So the same process that goes on when a mother drinks contaminated water goes on in the soil and in sewage, because these chemicals get highly concentrated very efficiently at the sewage treatment plant, and then when that sewage is processed and applied to land, everything from school playgrounds and golf courses to farms and forests, we basically have taken a problem that would have been, from an engineering perspective, easy to fix for water. Chemical companies were piping their waste into the Cuyahoga River and other rivers. It got carried out from there to the oceans and diluted out. So we lived in a world in 1970 where all of these chemicals that we worry about, for good reason, because we have an enormous body of science that shows that these biomagnified chemicals create problems that put us at risk of neurological disorders, cancer, birth defects, a host of adverse health effects in air and water needed to be dealt with. But we have, rather than taking those problems that all existed in a pipe in 1970 that went from some chemical industry to a river, could have been taken care of. It was contained. All we had to do really to solve that problem was take that pipe and direct it to, say, a steel tank that is pressurized at a high temperature and high pH, and it would break down PCBs, pesticides, pharmaceutical contaminants, to things like ammonia and nitrite that are the fundamental building blocks of life, phosphate. Those are things that we could not worry about from the sense of triggering things like autism or Alzheimer's or Parkinson's disease, that we now have a body of scientific literature that we're worried about that outcome. We've got now colon cancer showing up in teenagers. We never saw that before 10 years ago. And now it has become a national public health problem. It's gone from people only needing colonoscopies done after age 50 to teenagers needing it. We've got autism, which has come on the scene from out of the blue over the last 2 to 3 decades, where when I went to school, I knew of 2 people in our high school that had neurological disorders that was of any sort. Now we have every school's got a classroom of 30 or 40 children in it with autism. We've created this situation that I believe, based on the research I've done over the decades, our core problem here today is not lead or mercury or PCBs or any one group or handful of groups of chemicals which everybody's focusing on. Our fundamental problem is complexity of the ocean of pollutants we're now exposed to. We've inadvertently, over the past 30 years, taken a problem where you had to work at a chemical plant or some other industry or live close by one of those factories to get exposed to the levels of cancer-causing neurological disorder-causing chemicals to manifest, some occupational exposure. So now we all are exposed to countless chemicals, most of which we don't even know what they are and never will know what they are. We've increased the complexity. EPA's idea was, let's go to every municipality in the country that has become a repository of industrial and municipal chemicals, and let's mix them all together at sewage treatment plants and spread it all out, all around us where we live, work, and play. That's the worst imaginable idea for very fundamental reasons. But one, chemicals that are not even carcinogenic become carcinogenic when you mix them together. Chemicals that are not neurotoxic or don't cause birth defects on their own do so when you mix them together. So what we've done is mix the entire universe of chemicals together in the last 30 years that were in 1970 flowing out to the oceans and getting diluted, which is a problem in and of itself. But we turned that into a far more immediate problem for human beings and pets and farm animals, because we've now concentrated them millions of times over and we're spreading them out all around. And we're putting them now in the soil where we cannot clean this up. We could have fixed what was in that pipe that went out to the rivers, but we cannot fix it once it's spread in tons per acre on land by every municipality in this country.
Dr. Lewis, if I could, thank you for all that. Will you talk a little bit about the bill that we're talking about at the legislature right now about grit and grease trap waste and why those are so dangerous, and some of the other factors we've been talking about, like about how they break down, those sorts of things. Just kind of do an overview.
Thank you. That gets to the crux of the problem that we're dealing with at the moment. Here we have a situation in Texas that's taking what gets filtered out at wastewater treatment plants as grit and grease. Grit and grease contain petroleum distillates, or not distillates, but petroleum solvents in particular, greases, animal fats. They're taking the very thing that all these chemicals get concentrated into, that up until right now, and still at the present moment is being prohibited in Texas to take this material, greases and animal fats and oils, where all these chemicals are highly concentrated, and putting them on land. But a company has figured out a way to get around the system and doing that, and we stand in jeopardy of allowing this one company to do what has not been done before. That's take the very essence of where these chemicals are concentrated and start spreading that on land. And if we let this company in Texas get by with this, everybody else is going to jump on board, and it's going to be done everywhere before you know it.
You're talking with some of the officers today about, I know that one of the things that the company said last week was that you put this stuff in the soil and the microbes in the soil break it all down and it all goes away. And you've had a really kind of harrowing answer to that. Can you share that with everybody?
Sure. What seemed like to the company's representatives that is doing this, evidence that they don't have a problem is actually evidence they have created a far worse problem that they started with. Namely that when PCBs and pesticides of all sorts that are known to cause cancer, for example, when we take them into our bodies in air or water or food, it's actually not those chemicals that usually cause cancer. Those chemicals are filtered out of our blood when we're exposed. They are processed through the liver. The liver has enzymes that break them down into chemicals that are smaller molecular weights and more water soluble. They'll stick some hydroxyl groups on it as they cleave these aromatic rings. You end up with chemicals like benzoate pyrene, which is a smaller molecule than you have that you start with, but it is highly carcinogenic. It is actually the metabolites of these large molecules that are causing the adverse health effects that's being documented in the scientific literature. Unfortunately, we don't even know what most of these chemicals are. EPA has developed and identified analytical methods for a few hundred of these. There are actually millions of these in the environment. We'll never know what most of these things are. They're highly carcinogenic, mutagenic, and they're in mixtures, which means they're even worse. They become more carcinogenic in mixtures. So what appears to be to perhaps the state of Texas, and certainly to this company that thinks they're not creating any problems, because they go out and they look for PCBs or certain pesticides or whatever, and they're not there. That actually means we know they're going into their processing of these chemicals and coming out broken down. They don't even know what to look for. So what they look at as evidence they've solved a problem simply means they've converted it into the actual chemicals that cause neurological disorders, cancer, birth defects, etc. So we've got a lot of education to do for the local government officials, elected and otherwise. We've got an immediate problem here with this company and what they're doing to stop it before it starts multiplying across the country like a bad virus.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. We'll open up for questions. I want to say that we have to wrap up in about 5 or 10 minutes because we're taking Dr. Lewis, Dorothy and I are taking them around to Capitol offices to talk to legislators and their staffs directly about this science. So they're not just hearing it in the hearings, but they're hearing it directly so that we can make sure that the science shines through. Doesn't always work with the Texas legislature. This time we think it might. So are there any questions? Folks want to raise hands up in Dallas and Houston also. Let me do this real quick. Let me change my view so that I can, there you go. And anybody here also, does anybody have any questions? Kevin, is that you?
Sorry, that was just my hand.
Corey?
Yes. Hi, David. Thank you so much. I have a question about anaerobic digestion. Does this result in the same kind of metabolic processes or metabolites that pose a greater threat, or can those anaerobic digestion methods reduce the toxicity of sewage sludge?
Anaerobic digestion increases the overall toxicity and the complexity of the mixture of adverse of chemicals that will generate adverse health effects. Think of it this way: the human colon is a anaerobic digestion unit, and a lot of the adverse health effects come from these chemicals getting into the human colon. The bacteria that are carrying out anaerobic processes there break those chemicals down to the same chemicals you get at the wastewater treatment plant and vice versa. So there's no difference there. That doesn't solve any problems.
Well, my question, maybe I should get
Yeah, come around to the computer.
So my question is, are we to understand that this company in Texas next to Dorothy's Land is the only company that is doing this in the U.S. that you know of?
That's true. I don't know how accurate it is to say that since it's only one in Texas, it doesn't exist in other states. But the fact Texas is such a big and bold state. If that's the only one doing it here, I would say it may be the only one doing it anywhere.
Wow.
Yep. And is there anybody else? One last question? Anybody here? Okay, well, I want to thank Dr. Lewis for coming today. Let's give him a round of applause real quick.
It's my privilege.